Hello everyone, welcome back to Systematic Symphony of Species. In this video, we're going to talk about another species concept. This concept is called phylogenetic species concept, or in abbreviation PSC. It's a concept in the biological taxonomy that defines a species as a group of organisms that shares a common evolutionary history and forms a separate branch on the tree of life. This concept is based on the idea that species are monophyletic groups, meaning they include an ancestor and all of its descendants. A species is the smallest monophyletic cluster of individual organisms diagnosable by at least one trait. This concept defines a species based on shared derived traits and ancestry. But before we actually understand deeply this concept and its application, here are some useful definitions and ideas that helps us understand this concept better. The first one is gonna be cladistics. So what is cladistics? Cladistics is a method of classification that groups organisms based on shared derived traits, which are features that evolved in the common ancestor of a particular groups of organisms. Cladistics analysis involves constructing a phylogenetic tree or cladogram, the one as an example that you see in the pictures on the left. This cladogram actually represents the evolutionary relationships among organisms by identifying and analyzing shared derived characteristics. So, a common ancestor and the shared derived characteristics from that ancestor to the all descendants. So what does it mean, shared derived characteristics or shared derived traits? The shared derived traits, also known as synapomorphies, are characteristics that are present in a group of organisms and their common ancestor. However, these derived traits are not present in the more distant ancestors, so in the most recent common ancestor and all its descendants. These traits are used in cladistics to define and identify monophyletic groups. What does it mean, ancestry? Ancestry actually refers to the evolutionary relationships between organisms depicting their common origins and the branching points in their evolutionary history. Phylogenetic trees are often used to represent the evolutionary relationships and ancestry of different species. As you see in the pictures on the right, there are different organisms, and actually you can see that some shared derived traits between various organisms. For example, between bats and giraffes, we have mammary glands as a common trait between these two different organisms, which appears in the common ancestor of these two as an example. The other concept that we just heard is called monophyly. What does it mean, monophyly or a monophyletic group? As you see in part A in the picture on the right, monophyly actually refers to a group that consists of a common ancestor and all its descendants. So as you see here in the color purple, it's B as a common ancestor, and then you have C and F, and each C and F are actually common ancestors of groups D and E and G and H respectively. In a monophyletic group, all members share a single common evolutionary origin, forming a complete branch on a phylogenetic tree. According to the phylogenetic species concept, a species is considered monophyletic if it consists of a common ancestor and all of its descendants. So as you see, B and all of its descendants, including C, F, D, E, G, and H. In the context of the phylogeny and the phylogenetic analysis, researchers use molecular data such as DNA sequences to construct phylogenetic trees, and a monophyletic group on such a tree represent a potential species. And what does it mean, paraphyly and paraphyletic, as you see in part C in the picture on the right? So, paraphyly occurs when a group includes a common ancestor, well, the similar situation that we just observed in the monophyletic group, but not all of its descendants. So as you see, A is a common ancestor for many other groups and it starts branching out. However, in a paraphyletic group, for example, as we see, it's A, I, and J, and K, and it doesn't include B and its descendants. So not all the descendants are included in a paraphyletic group. In other words, a paraphyletic group is a subset of a monophyletic group, excluding certain descendants that have branched off from the common ancestor. The phylogenetic species concept rejects paraphyletic groups as a valid species. If a group includes a common ancestor, but not all of its descendants, it's not recognized as a separate species. Paraphyletic group would suggest that some members of the group are more closely related to a species outside the group than to the others within it, which goes against the idea of a cohesive evolutionary unit. The other concept here is going to be polyphyly or polyphyletic, as you see in part B on the pictures on the right. Polyphyly actually refers to a situation where a group doesn't share a common evolutionary origin, as you see E and G. So, well, they have separate ancestors. For G is going to be F and for E is going to be C. In a polyphyletic group, the members have different evolutionary ancestors, and their inclusion in the group is based on superficial similarities rather than shared ancestry. Polyphyly is also rejected like the paraphyly as we saw in the previous slide under the phylogenetic species concept. A species is expected to have a single common ancestor, and groups with multiple evolutionary origins are not considered valid species. Polyphyletic groups may indicate convergence or other processes that do not reflect a shared evolutionary history. Now, what does it mean, those shared traits and synapomorphies? A synapomorphy is a shared derived trait that is found in two or more taxa and their most recent common ancestor, but it's not present in more distant ancestors. Synapomorphies are important in cladistics and phylogenies because they help identify and define monophyletic groups or clades on a phylogenetic tree. So, as you see in the pictures on the right, and you see in the blue box, it's called synapomorphy. So, they are actually marked in dark color. So, this dark color it actually means derived trait. As you see, it's present on the terminal members and also is present in the most recent common ancestor, but not in the distant ancestors colored with the grayish color. So if two species share a specific genetic mutation that is not present in their common ancestor with a third species, that genetic mutation would be considered a synapomorphy for the clade formed by the two species. And what does it mean? Well, we talked about just synapomorphy, but what does it mean plesiomorphy? A plesiomorphy, also known as a primitive or ancestral trait, is a characteristic that is shared by a group of organisms, including their common ancestor, but unlike the synapomorphy, it is also present in the most distant ancestors. Plesiomorphies are not useful for determining evolutionary relationships within a species group because they do not provide information about most recent shared ancestry. For example, if a group of birds share feathers with their common ancestor with reptiles, feathers would be considered a plesiomorphy for that group. And what does it mean, apomorphy? An apomorphy is a derived trait that is unique to a particular taxon or a group of organisms and not found in its ancestor. So it's really important. It is only present in a specific taxa and not in the ancestor. Apomorphies can be further classified into autapomorphies and synapomorphies. Autapomorphy is a trait that is unique to a particular taxon and not shared with any other taxa. Synapomorphy, as mentioned earlier, is a trait that is shared by a group of organisms and their most recent common ancestor, but not present in the more distant ancestors. And also we have simpliciomorphy. What is a simpliciomorphy? A simpliciomorphy is a shared ancestral trait. It is a characteristic that is found in two or more taxa, their common ancestor, and more distant ancestors. Simpliciomorphies are not useful for determining close evolutionary relationships because they are features inherited from a common ancestor that may be shared by a wide range of taxa. Now, getting back to the phylogenetic species concept, it actually emerged as a response to the limitations of earlier species concept, particularly in the face of advances in molecular biology and the ability to study evolutionary relationships through genetic data. It gained prominence in the late 20th century and is closely tied to the rise of the molecular phylogenetics. Now, let's just have a very brief look to the historical context of the phylogenetic species concept. As we talked earlier and pointed out, in the mid-20th century, molecular biology began a revolution in the field of biology. Technologies such as DNA sequencing allowed scientists to examine genetic material and compare it across different organisms. The other historical context behind the phylogenetic species concept is the idea of cladistics and phylogenetics that we just talked earlier. In the 1960s and 70s, in the field of cladistics, that actually they become very prominent, they provided a foundation for the phylogenetic species concept. And as mentioned earlier, cladistics is a method of biological classification that arranges taxa based on shared derived characteristics. This approach laid the groundwork for phylogeny analysis, which involves constructing evolutionary trees to represent the relationships between species. The other historical concept is going to be the necessity for new species concept. As molecular data became more relevant and accessible, researchers encountered situations where traditional species concepts such as biological species concept based on reproductive isolation were inadequate. Asexual organism actually and the extinct species and organism with limited observable reproductive behavior pose challenges to existing species concepts. The other contribution to the phylogenetic species concept was the Pat Barker's contribution, an Australian botanist who played a significant role in advocating phylogenetic approach to species delimitation. In the early 1990s, Barker emphasized the importance of using molecular data and phylogenetic analysis to identify evolutionary lineages and define species. As we just talked, the rise of DNA sequencing technology in the 1980s and 1990s allowed scientists to obtain genetic data more efficiently and at a larger scale. This enabled the scientists to go and compare DNA sequences to infer evolutionary relationships. And here we had a theory as well which contributed deeply to the phylogenetic species concept, which is a coalescent theory. This theory developed in population genetics and became very influential in the study of molecular evolution. It provided a theoretical framework for understanding the common ancestry of genes within a population and contributed to the concept foundation and the conceptual foundation of the phylogenetic species concept. And the explicit formulation of the phylogenetic species concept actually gained traction in 1990s. This concept, as articulated by authors like Kevin DeCourage and also Joel Crocroft, emphasizes the importance of monophyly, species as monophyletic groups and phylogenetic trees. And this concept gradually found its way into taxonomic practices, especially in cases where molecular data provided valuable insight into evolutionary relationships. Researchers began to use genetic information to define species boundaries and identify distinct evolutionary lineages. This concept has continued to evolve and also got refined as molecular techniques and analytical methods turned to be more advanced and complicated. Ongoing debates and discussions within the scientific community contribute to the ongoing development and application of the concept. Now let's have a very brief look if we want to compare the phylogenetic species concept and the biological species concept. But before that, if we want to bring some key features of the phylogenetic species concept, the first one is going to be the genetic data. So this concept, as mentioned earlier, relies heavily on molecular data, especially DNA sequences, to infer evolutionary relationships. By comparing genetic information, scientists can construct phylogenetic trees that represent the evolutionary history of organisms. The other one is going to be the idea of monophyly, which is a central block of this concept. And it's that the species should be a monophyletic group, meaning it includes a common ancestor and all of its descendants. This is depicted in phylogenetic tree where a species form a distinct branch. And this concept emphasizes the idea of a species are independently evolving lineages. As population diverge genetically, they form separate branches on the phylogenetic tree. Now let's go and compare, after getting the key features of the phylogenetic species concept, a comparison with the biological species concept. The phylogenetic species concept, as mentioned earlier, defines a species based on evolutionary relationships and common ancestry. It emphasizes the idea that a species is a monophyletic group, meaning it includes an ancestral species and all of its descendants. On the other hand, the biological species concept, as we discussed it in the previous video, defines a species based on reproductive isolation. According to the biological species concept, individuals of the same species can interbreed and produce viable fertile offspring, while individuals from different species cannot. In the phylogenetic species concept, reproductive isolation is not a central criterion to define a species under this concept. Instead, the emphasis is on the evolutionary history and the genetic relationship among populations. While in the biological species concept, the key block is going to be the biological and the reproductive isolation. So if populations are reproductively isolated from one another, they are considered distinct species. The phylogenetic species concept is more applicable to a broader range of organisms, including asexual species and those with limited observable reproductive behaviors. It's particularly useful in the molecular era, where genetic data can be used to infer evolutionary relationships. While the biological species concept is more applicable to sexually reproducing organisms and is less suitable for asexual species, extinct species, or species with limited reproductive data. The phylogenetic species concept is less dependent on the observable criteria and observation of current reproductive interactions and is more focused on historical and evolutionary patterns of organisms. While the biological species concept relies on current observation of reproductive compatibility and may be challenging to apply to extinct or those for which reproductive behavior is not well understood. And the phylogenetic species concept is often considered more practical in cases where detailed observation of reproductive behaviors are challenging or impossible, such as within a microscopic or extinct organism. While, as mentioned earlier, the biological species concept is more practical for species that are easily observed, especially in cases where reproductive isolation can be directly studied. So in conclusion, the phylogenetic species concept is widely used, especially in fields where molecular data are abundant, such as microbiology, botany, and certain areas of zoology. While it has become a valuable tool, it's important to note that different species concept may be more appropriate in a specific context, and researchers often consider multiple lines of evidence when delimiting a species. While the phylogenetic species concept actually provides a valuable framework for understanding species as evolutionary entities, it may encounter challenges in cases where phylogenetic relationships are not clear, or when hybridization, introgression, or incomplete lineage sorting confound species boundaries. Really appreciate for your attention to this concept, and we will talk more about various species concepts in the coming videos. Thank you and see you soon.